All right, you guys sent us some fascinating stuff to dig into. Um, President Trump's address at the World Economic Forum,
Hmm.
like just 3 days after his second inauguration. Seems like he covered like a ton of ground. So let's just get right to it. His speech was delivered via teleconference on January 23rd, 2025. And he kind of jumps right into his vision for like a golden age of America.
Yeah, it's a bold move right off the bat, declaring a golden age, especially on a platform that's known for, global collaboration and stuff. But it's classic Trump, bold, attention grabbing, and very much focused on America first.
For sure. And he sets the stage by, highlighting his decisive election victory. Even goes as far as to say that, pundits are calling it the most consequential win in over a century. And he kind of uses this to launch into a critique of the previous administration, blaming them for a bunch of stuff, $8 trillion deficit, energy restrictions, inflation, those sky-high interest rates.
Yeah, he's definitely painting a picture. Like, the old way was a disaster, and only his leadership can fix it. It's a powerful message, especially if you're someone who's been struggling, economically, or just feels like the country's been going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, I'm the only one who can get the job done. And to prove his point, he immediately announces all these policy changes, a federal hiring freeze, a regulation freeze, and he creates a brand new Department of Government Efficiency, like trying to hit the reset button on all the government bureaucracy.
Yeah, it really shows his commitment to, streamlining the government, reducing its size, all that. It's a clear signal to the federal workforce and to the world that things are going to be different under his watch.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. He goes on to, like, dismantle key initiatives from the previous administration, scraps the Green New Deal, pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord, ends the electric vehicle mandate. It's a huge shift in environmental policy. He's clearly putting traditional energy sources first, like oil and gas.
Yeah, this is a big gamble. He's putting all his chips on American energy independence as a path to, economic revitalization. It could lead to lower energy costs and a boom in domestic production. But it also raises serious concerns about the environment, the long-term sustainability of that kind of approach.
Totally. He even declares a national energy emergency to unlock American oil and gas reserves. He calls them liquid gold. He paints a picture of America, like an energy powerhouse, fueled by its own resources and stuff.
It's a powerful image, and one that likely resonates with, his base. But it's also kind of a concerning sign, for people worried about climate change and renewable energy. He's doubling down on fossil fuels, basically ignoring, all the warnings from scientists, experts who say we need to transition to cleaner energy sources.
And it's not just about energy. He's also talking about, the U.S. becoming like the world leader in artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Crypto. He wants American innovation to, like, drive global progress and all that.
Yeah. It's an ambitious vision. And it's not totally unrealistic, given, America's strengths in technology and innovation and all. But it also raises questions about how he actually plans to achieve it. Will it be through government investment, deregulation, or a combination of both? And are there, potential downsides to this push for, technological dominance?
Well, he doesn't shy away from the potential downsides.
Yeah.
But he frames them as, like, necessary sacrifices on the path to greatness, For example, he boasts about launching the largest deregulation campaign in history, claiming the previous administration imposed a crazy $50,000 in regulatory costs per household. His goal, he says, is to, like, slash that burden, unleash the power of American businesses and all that.
Yeah, deregulation can definitely stimulate economic activity, but it's important to remember that regulations exist for a reason. They protect consumers, workers, and the environment from the potential harms of, unchecked corporate greed. Rolling back regulations is basically like saying, I trust businesses to do the right thing. But history's shown us that that's not always the case.
Right. It's a gamble for sure. And on top of that, he promises the largest tax cut in American history, reducing the corporate tax rate to just 15% for companies manufacturing in the U.S.
This is textbook supply-side economics. Cut taxes for businesses, incentivize them to invest, create jobs, which ultimately benefits, everyone. But it's not always that simple. Sometimes tax cuts just lead to higher corporate profits, don't actually trickle down to workers.
He's making a direct pitch to businesses worldwide, saying, come make your product in America, and you'll get the lowest taxes on earth. But if you don't, be prepared to pay a big tariff. Classic carrot and stick approach. Lure businesses back to the U.S. Protect American jobs.
Yeah, it's a protectionist stance. Could have big implications for global trade. It might attract some businesses. But it also risks, triggering trade wars, increasing costs for consumers and stuff.
And to sweeten the deal, he highlights all the investment announcements since his election. SoftBank is pledging $200 billion. Oracle, SoftBank, and OpenAI are pouring $500 billion into AI infrastructure. And there's even talk of a $1 trillion investment from Saudi Arabia.
Those are huge numbers, and if they actually materialize, it could mean renewed confidence in the American economy under his leadership. But it's important to remember they're just pledges, not guarantees. The actual impact is still uncertain.
Exactly. And even if they do come through, we need to think about how they'll be distributed. Who will benefit? Will they create jobs, boost wages for, ordinary Americans, or just line the pockets of corporations and wealthy investors?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of the debate over his economic policies. Are they designed to benefit everyone, or are they mostly geared toward helping the, already wealthy and powerful?
And then, out of nowhere, he calls on Saudi Arabia and OPEC to lower oil prices, arguing that it would help end the Russia-Ukraine war and allow for, interest rate cuts.
This is fascinating. He's linking economic policy to, geopolitics, suggesting American economic strength can be used to achieve foreign policy goals. It's a bold move. We'll have to see if it works out.
Right, it's like he's playing 4D chess, trying to, manipulate global markets and international relations to get what he wants. But it's risky. Could backfire if he's not careful.
And it raises questions about his understanding of global energy markets. Does he think Saudi Arabia and OPEC will just do what he asks? And what happens to global energy security if he tries to use American influence to manipulate oil prices?
So much to think about. But one thing's for sure, he's not afraid to make bold moves. Shake things up. Agree with him or not, you gotta admit, he's a force to be reckoned with.
No doubt. He's not afraid to challenge the status quo. And that can be, exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Okay, so we've covered his vision for a golden age of America, the big policy changes, his pronouncements on the world stage. But that's just the beginning. We still need to get into his America First trade policy, his stance on immigration, border security, and his controversial social and cultural agenda.
And don't forget the Q&A with the business leaders. That's where things got really interesting, with tough questions about deregulation, trade, the rapid pace of change under his leadership.
All right, he doubles down on his America First trade policy, taking aim at countries like Canada and the EU for what he sees as unfair trade practices.
Yeah, this could mean more trade tension and disputes, His focus on reciprocity and a level playing field could lead to renegotiated trade deals or even trade wars, which could have big implications for global trade and even, impact your own economic situation.
He even jokes that Canada should just become a U.S. state to avoid tariffs.
Yeah, that's classic Trump. Humor and hyperbole to make a serious point. Canada joining the U.S., probably not going to happen. But it shows how frustrated he is with what he sees as unfair trade practices and his willingness to shake things up.
Now, switching to immigration, he declares a national emergency at the southern border, announces actions to stop illegal immigration and return undocumented migrants. He talks about deploying military and National Guard troops, painting a picture of a strong response.
Yeah, this is him continuing his hardline stance on immigration. It's going to be a big issue. Supporters will praise his focus on border security. Critics will say his approach is inhumane and doesn't work.
Moving on to social and cultural issues, he unveils executive orders aimed at what he calls woke policies.
This is a big shift towards conservative social policy. His actions on government censorship, diversity, meritocracy, traditional gender roles are likely to be popular with his base. But they'll also face opposition from people who see these policies as discriminatory, a step backwards.
He really seems to be focused on ending government censorship and restoring free speech. He claims his actions have saved free speech in America. He also gets rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, calls them nonsense.
It's a direct challenge to the increasing focus on diversity and inclusion, dismissing them as nonsense. People who want more representation and equity are not going to be happy about that.
And this is going to be controversial. He reinforces a merit-based system and traditional gender roles. He even says there are only two genders and promises to stop transgender individuals from competing in women's sports.
That's a polarizing stance, reflects a very conservative view on gender. It'll probably face legal challenges and spark more debates about transgender rights and inclusion.
So thinking about the societal implications of these policies, it's possible they could lead to more social division or rollback of progress on LGBTQ+ rights. and even a chilling effect on free speech if the government decides certain viewpoints are unacceptable.
We have to remember, these policies will likely have a bigger impact on marginalized communities. Communities already facing barriers. We need to listen to the people most affected by these decisions.
Turning to foreign policy, he says he wants to restore peace and stability around the world. Outlines a bunch of initiatives to try and do that.
This is a big shift from his domestic agenda to, a global vision.
Yeah.
His approach to foreign policy has been kind of a mix of, isolationism, unilateralism, and transactional diplomacy. It's likely to reshape global alliances and redefine America's role in the world.
He wants NATO nations to up their defense spending to 5% of GDP. Says the U.S. has been carrying an unfair burden for too long.
He's been saying this for a while now. He's criticized NATO allies a lot for not contributing enough to, collective defense. This could strain those relationships and raise questions about the future of that transatlantic alliance.
He also points to a ceasefire agreement in the Middle East and the return of hostages, suggesting that his administration has already had some foreign policy wins.
It's important to note that he doesn't give a lot of specifics about these agreements. He could be exaggerating his role or leaving out important details.
He then expresses hope for a peaceful resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He says that millions of soldiers are being killed. It's time to end the carnage.
It's a powerful description of the war's devastation. But we need to fact-check his claims. Millions of soldiers killed. That seems very unlikely, even though the war has definitely resulted in a lot of casualties.
He also mentions that he was talking to President Putin about denuclearization before the ridiculous election supposedly stopped their progress. He suggests that China would have been involved, that it would have been an unbelievable thing for the planet.
Hard to verify that without more evidence. He's made claims before, especially about conversations with foreign leaders, that turned out to be, not entirely accurate. He could be overstating his role or misrepresenting Putin and Xi's positions.
He ends by emphasizing his administration's accomplishments in just 3 days. Says they've done more than other administrations in 4 years. He's committed to making America greater, bigger, stronger, better than ever before.
That's classic Trump, emphasizing how exceptional he is, how much he gets done. But it's important to think critically about these claims and consider the potential long-term consequences of his policies.
Now let's get into the Q&A with the business leaders. Things get even more interesting here. Steve Schwartzman, CEO of Blackstone Group, starts by pointing out that European business leaders are frustrated with the EU's regulations. They say it's why growth is slower. He asks Trump to explain his theory of deregulation, what outcomes he expects.
That's a smart question from Schwartzman. Setting up Trump to contrast his pro-business approach with the, perceived burdens of European regulations. It also highlights a tension of the forum, that struggle between globalization and national interests.
Trump tells a story about a project he had in Ireland that was held up by EU regulations. He says Ireland approved it in a week, but the EU would have taken 5 to 6 years. So he just abandoned the investment.
The anecdote shows how inefficient he thinks the EU bureaucracy is. But this is just one side of the story, right? There might be good reasons for the EU's regulations, like protecting the environment or consumer safety.
He then criticizes the EU's trade policies, saying they treat the U.S. unfairly, with tariffs and taxes, while benefiting from access to the American market.
This is something he talks about a lot, the idea that the U.S. is being taken advantage of in trade deals. He often uses strong language and exaggerations to make his case, appealing to that sense of national grievance.
He points to the EU's VAT tax, restrictions on American farm products and cars, and their court cases against American tech giants like Apple, Google, and Facebook as examples of this unfair treatment. He even says landing fees for American airlines in Europe are brutal compared to China.
He's not completely wrong. The EU's trade rules and regulations are complicated, can be difficult for American businesses, but it's important to consider the EU's perspective too. They might see these measures as necessary to protect their own industries, consumers, and environment.
Trump ends with a clear message. We have some very big complaints with the EU, and his administration will do something about it.
He's signaling that he's going to be confrontational with the EU about trade. It could lead to renegotiated trade deals, increased tariffs, maybe even a trade war, which could be bad for both sides.
Next up is Patrick Pouyanné, CEO of Total Energies. He asks Trump about his stance on LNG exports from the U.S.
This is a good question. It brings up energy security, the U.S.'s role as a major energy producer, and that potential conflict between domestic energy needs and export commitments.
Pouyanné is worried that too many LNG projects in the U.S. could make domestic gas prices go up. He suggests putting a pause on new investments. He even asks if Trump would guarantee supply for U.S. LNG exports to Europe.
This puts Trump in a tough spot. He wants to promote American energy and exports, but he also doesn't want to upset American consumers who might have to pay more for energy.
Trump reassures Poyane that he would guarantee the supply of U.S. LNG exports to Europe. He says, if we make a deal, you'll get it.
Typical Trump, emphasizing deal-making and personal assurances. But how would he guarantee that supply if there's a disruption or a shortage?
Then he talks about how he fast-tracked the approval of 2 LNG plants in Louisiana during his first term, got them done in less than a week, after they were stalled for over a decade.
He wants to show how effective he is at getting things done, cutting through red tape. But doing projects so quickly, without proper scrutiny, raises concerns about the environment and safety.
He believes that more LNG production will lower prices. He wants to use emergency declarations to speed up approvals for new energy infrastructure, including AI plants and electric generating facilities.
This shows he prefers fast development, that he's willing to bypass the usual environmental review processes. Industries will love it, environmental groups probably won't.
He even proposes building their own electric generating facilities right next to the new plants, maybe fueled by coal as a backup.
Surprising, right? Increasing reliance on coal, a very polluting fuel. It shows his skepticism towards renewable energy and his belief that traditional sources are still important.
He wraps up by talking about America's energy resources. We have more coal than anybody. We also have more oil and gas than anybody.
True, the U.S. does have a lot of those resources, but we have to consider the environmental and climate change implications of relying on them so much.
Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, asked Trump about the rapid pace of policy changes and executive orders in the first 3 days of his second term. How will he balance these actions with his goals of economic growth, bringing down inflation, and maintaining a strong stock market?
Good question. It highlights the potential for uncertainty and volatility. His decision-making style is unpredictable, impulsive. It makes people worry about unintended consequences from big policy changes that aren't thought through carefully enough.
Trump says his actions will bring down inflation and create jobs. He points to his success reducing the corporate tax rate from 40% to 21%, and he wants to reduce it further to 15% for companies manufacturing in the U.S. He says it will be by far the lowest of a large country, a large, rich, powerful country by far, not even a contest.
Typical Trump. Superlatives and bold claims to project strength and success. But we need to look at these claims carefully. Consider the potential economic and social trade-offs.
He also wants to reinstate the one-year deduction for businesses. He says it was amazing during his first term. He knows this needs approval from the Democrats, but he thinks they'll be reluctant to oppose it, because it could be seen as a 45% tax increase if the Trump tax plan isn't renewed.
This is strategic, framing it as a potential tax increase instead of a cut, trying to pressure the Democrats into supporting his plan by making them afraid of being seen as raising taxes.
And then, out of the blue, he criticizes banks for not doing enough business with conservatives. He specifically calls out Bank of America as Brian Moynihan. He says the conservatives are being denied access to banking services, and he urges banks to open your banks to conservatives because what you're doing is wrong.
This is unusual. A president getting involved in the business of private companies like this raises concerns about political interference in the banking sector and discrimination against certain groups.
Moynihan tries to respond, but the moderator cuts him off and moves on to the next question.
Looks like the moderator is trying to avoid a fight, keep things on topic. It also shows how much power the president has in this conversation.
Ana Botín, the executive chairman of Banco Santander, is next. She starts by congratulating him on his historic victory. She introduces her bank, talks about its large customer base, its investments in the U.S. Then she says she supports his focus on deregulation and reducing bureaucracy. Asks about his priorities, the speed of these changes.
This is a carefully crafted question, aligning Santander's interests with his agenda, but also trying to get specifics on his plans. Smart move by Botín, positioning her bank as a potential beneficiary of his policies.
Trump praises Botín and her bank, says they've done a fantastic job. He says he's committed to swift action, claims his administration has already achieved in 3 days what nobody thought were possible to do in years. He credits this to cutting wasteful spending on crazy things like the Green New Deal.
It's classic Trump, isn't it? Boasting, attacking his opponents. But his claims about the Green New Deal are misleading. It was never fully implemented. It's debatable what its impact on the economy actually was.
Then he goes on a rant about the Green New Deal, calls it a total disgrace. thought up by people that were average students, less than average students, I might add, and never even took a course in energy or the environment. He makes fun of the idea that the world was going to end in 12 years, says the 12 years is come and gone, it was going to end, it was going to all foam into earth, but, the time has come.
This is typical Trump, using ridicule and exaggeration to dismiss his opponents. It appeals to his base, who don't tend to believe in climate change or environmental regulations.
Then he talks about his environmental record during his first term. We had the cleanest air, we had the cleanest water, and yet we had the most productive economy in the history of our country. He says this is because of deregulation. Suggests his administration can far surpass these achievements in his second term.
Misleading. The U.S. economy did grow during his first term, but his environmental record is mixed at best. His administration rolled back a lot of environmental regulations. Air and water quality didn't really improve much while he was in office.
He then emphasizes that he wants other nations to respect the U.S. on trade. He talks about Canada. Complains about the U.S. trade deficit with Canada. Jokes that they can always become a state, and if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera.
Trump's got a particular style, mixing humor, bluster, and protectionism. Canada becoming a U.S. state. Not likely. But it shows how frustrated he is with trade deficits, and that he's willing to use unusual tactics to deal with them.
He criticizes Canada's trade practices. Says the U.S. doesn't need their cars, lumber, oil, or gas. Compares this with Mexico. We're dealing with Mexico, I think, very well.
Interesting comparison. His relationship with Mexico during his first term was pretty contentious. Remember the wall, renegotiating NAFTA. Maybe this more positive assessment means his approach to trade relations with Mexico is changing.
Then he criticizes other countries, too, saying that there's hardly a nation in the world that hasn't taken advantage of the U.S. on trade. He blames politicians that for some reason, and probably mostly it's stupidity, but you could also say other reasons, but mostly stupidity, they've allowed other nations to take advantage of the U.S. And we can't allow that to happen anymore.
That's a big generalization. Shows his worldview. He believes the U.S. is always being exploited by other countries. It's a powerful message. Appeals to his base who feel the U.S. is getting a raw deal in the global economy.
He finishes by saying he wants to eliminate the national debt, create a strong economy that benefits both the U.S. and its allies. He wants to meet with President Putin to end the war in Ukraine. Says that millions of lives are being wasted. It's time to stop the carnage.
This is a change in tone from his earlier comments about Russia and Putin. Before he was saying Putin was responsible for the war. Now he's saying it's a tragedy that needs to end. For the sake of both countries. Maybe he's willing to use diplomacy to resolve the conflict.
He says it's not about economics or geopolitics for him. It's from the standpoint of millions of lives are being wasted. Beautiful, young people are being shot in the battlefield. He describes the war in detail. Says, the bullet of very flat land, as I said, and the bullet goes, no, there's no hiding. And a bullet, the only thing going to stop the bullet is a human body.
This is unusual for Trump. He doesn't often show empathy or sensitivity to human suffering. Maybe he's genuinely moved by the war. Or maybe he's trying to seem more compassionate, appeal to a wider audience.
He says, more people have died in the war than are being reported. Far, far more people have died than is being reported, and I've seen that. But far, far more people have died. He says this because he's seen destroyed buildings. When you look at a city that's become a demolition site, where big buildings have been collapsed by missiles hitting them and everything else, and they say one person was slightly injured. No, many people were killed. Those are big buildings. I was surprised at how that was my business. These are buildings that go 2 and 3 blocks long. They're 20 stories high. They're big, powerful buildings. Then they were knocked down, and there were a lot of people in those buildings. They had announced that 2 people were injured. That's not true. So I think you're going to find that there were many more people killed in Ukraine and the Ukraine war than anybody has any idea.
That's a serious accusation. Needs to be investigated. But remember, Trump often exaggerates, especially about things he's supposedly seen himself.
He finishes his comments on the war by saying, if you look now, so many of the people being killed are soldiers just facing each other with guns, rifles, and drones, the new form of warfare drones, and it's a very sad thing to see. He then repeats that he wants to get that stopped.
Shows how warfare is changing, more reliance on technology, and it emphasizes how much war costs in human life, even with advanced weapons.
The moderator changes the subject to the relationship between the U.S. and China. They make up almost half of global GDP. He mentions Trump's phone call with President Xi Jinping last Friday, asks how Trump sees the relationship over the next 4 years.
This is a big deal. The U.S.-China relationship is important for the world's economy and security. It's a complex and often difficult relationship between two superpowers. It'll be interesting to see how that relationship goes, especially with all the recent tension around trade and technology and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's Trump, right? Not really known for, like, diplomacy.
True. But, he did make some deals no one saw coming during his first term, like the Abraham Accords in the Middle East, so maybe he'll surprise us again.
Well, he definitely surprised everyone with how he answered that question about China. He starts off by saying that he thinks the relationship is very good
Hmm.
and that they're, quote, going to have a very good relationship.
That's a big change from before. Remember how he used to talk about China like they were rivals, a threat to America?
Yeah. But then he goes on about how he wants fairness in trade. Says, all we want is fairness. We just want a level playing field. We don't want to take advantage. And then, of course, he has to take a shot at President Biden, saying he let the U.S. trade deficit with China get out of hand.
Trade is still a big issue for him. That $1.1 trillion trade deficit. He sees it as weakness, unfairness. He's going to try to fix it, even if it means tariffs and protectionist measures.
He even calls the deficit ridiculous. Just an unfair relationship. Doesn't really sound like someone trying to build a very good relationship.
It's a tough balance. He wants a good economic relationship with China, but he also wants to look tough, like he's standing up for America.
And he kind of tries to do both. He praises President Xi, says he likes President Xi very much, that they've always had a very good relationship, but that it was strained by COVID, which of course he blames on China.
It's interesting. He's trying to separate his personal feelings about Xi from his policy disagreements. Like he's leaving the door open for talking and working together, while still holding them accountable.
But then he asks for China's help to end the war in Ukraine. Hopefully, China can help us stop the war with, in particular, Russia-Ukraine. And they have a great deal of power over that situation, and we'll work with them.
Big ask. He's saying he's willing to work with China on a major world issue. It shows how much influence China has now.
He even says he talked about it with Xi on the phone. I mentioned that during our phone conversation with President Xi, and hopefully we can work together and get that stopped.
I wonder how China will respond. Their relationship with Russia is complicated. They haven't wanted to choose sides in the conflict.
And then, this was a shock, Trump says that he and Putin were talking about denuclearization. Before the ridiculous election messed things up, he says China would have been part of it, that it would have been unbelievable for the world.
Wow. That's a big claim. Hard to know what to make of it without more information. If it's true, it would be huge for nuclear nonproliferation. But maybe he's exaggerating his role, or maybe Putin wasn't really serious about denuclearizing.
He didn't give any proof, which is hard to ignore, especially with his, history of making claims about foreign leaders that weren't exactly solid.
Yeah, we got to be careful about taking his word for it. He's known for embellishing, making himself look as good as possible.
He did say that tremendous amounts of money are being spent on nuclear, and the destructive capability is something that we don't even want to talk about today because you don't want to hear it. It's too depressing.
Chilling, right? Nuclear war. It's almost impossible to imagine how bad it would be.
He said he hopes denuclearization talks can start up again. But the moderator cut him off.
I wish we'd heard more about his denuclearization plans. It's such a big issue. Any progress would be great.
The moderator then asked him straight out, does he think there will be a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia by next year's Davos?
Putting him on the spot, making him predict something about a very messy situation.
And he just dodged the question. You're going to have to ask Russia. Ukraine is ready to make a deal. And then he went on about how the war should never have started. Blamed the Biden administration.
Classic Trump. Never his fault. Always someone else to blame.
He even said, this is a war that should have never started. If I were president, it would never have started. This is a war that should have never, ever been started. And it wasn't started during there was never even talk about it. I knew that it was the apple of President Putin's eye, but I also knew that there was no way he was going in and he wasn't going to go in. And then when I was out, bad things happened, bad things were said, a lot of stupidity all around, and you end up with what you have. Now you have all these bombed out cities. They look like demolition sites with many people killed.
Come on. That's just not true. Lots of people were talking about a possible conflict between Russia and Ukraine while he was president. And some of the things he did, like pulling out of that nuclear treaty, might have made Putin bolder.
He's trying to change history, make himself look good,
Yeah.
even if it means twisting the truth.
He's been doing that forever. He creates his own version of reality, one that works for him.
Yeah.
And he just keeps repeating it until people believe it.
And then he contradicts himself. He says Ukraine is the reason there's no peace deal, even though he said he wanted to meet with Putin to end the war.
It's hard to know what he really thinks. His positions change so much. Peace 1 minute, blaming Ukraine the next. It's whatever works for him at the time.
He did say he felt bad for the Ukrainian people. I think the thing that you'll see about Ukraine is that far, far more people have died than is being reported. And I've seen that. But far, far more people have died.
That's a big deal if it's true. It needs to be looked into. But, Trump has a habit of exaggerating, especially about things he's supposedly seen himself.
He talked about the destruction in Ukrainian cities. When you look at a city that's become a demolition site, where big buildings have been collapsed by missiles hitting them and everything else, and they say one person was slightly injured, no, many people were killed. Those are big buildings. I was surprised at how that was my business. These are buildings that go 2 and 3 blocks long. They're 20 stories high. They're big, powerful buildings. Then they were knocked down, and there were a lot of people in those buildings. They had announced that 2 people were injured. That's not true. So I think you're going to find that there were many more people killed in Ukraine and the Ukraine war than anybody has any idea.
That's a powerful image. Anyone who's seen pictures of Ukraine knows how bad it is. But Trump's not neutral here. He wants to make the war look like Biden's fault and downplay his own role in how it started.
And he finished by saying, when you see pictures of the fields that I see, nobody wants to see it. You'll never be the same.
Makes you think about how much war costs. Even if the numbers are lower than Trump says, every life lost is terrible.
The moderator thanked Trump for being there. Joining us, the third day in your presidency, live, taking questions here. He said it was so appreciated and that they're already ready for receiving you next year in person.
That's a lot of praise, especially since the World Economic Forum is all about globalism and working together, things Trump usually rejects. Maybe he was just being polite. Or maybe he's trying to keep Trump happy, keep him involved.
Trump thanked everyone. Thank you very much, thank you. Then he said, I would have been there myself, except the inauguration was 2 days ago. I thought I might be a little bit quick to make it the first stop, but we'll get there one day. We hope to get there.
Typical Trump. It's all about him, how important he is. He just had to remind everyone that he's the president and that he's very busy.
The moderator said, all the best from Davos. And that was it for Trump's address.
What a whirlwind. So many announcements, promises, provocations. Who knows what his second term will be like, but it's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Definitely. What was the most interesting thing about his address for you? What really stood out?
I thought it was fascinating how he was trying to do both. America first, but also being part of the world, pulling out of agreements, tariffs, criticizing allies, but also saying NATO should spend more, asking China to help with Ukraine, saying he almost had a denuclearization deal with Putin.
But he wants to be the tough guy who puts America first, but also the deal maker who fixes problems for everyone.
Exactly. Can he do both? Who knows? Only time will tell how his policies will really turn out.
Well, one thing's for sure.
Yeah.
We'll be watching closely, bringing you the latest analysis.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's think about Trump's message to the rest of the world. Do you think other countries will like what he's saying, or will it make them pull away?
Great question. We'll get into that more in our next part. We'll also look at what his policies could mean for America and the world.
Stay tuned for part 3. We'll keep unpacking Trump's address and what it means for you.
So, thinking about Trump's America First message to the world, it was pretty strong, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of a contrast to the whole vibe of the World Economic Forum, like they're all about working together, finding solutions to problems we all share. And then Trump comes in with this message about putting America first, even if it shakes things up globally.
It's like he thinks if one country wins, another one has to lose. And he wants to make sure America's the winner, even if it means using like tariffs and trade wars and stuff.
Right. And that's going to cause problems with other countries, especially the ones who are used to, working together. We've already seen the EU and Canada pushing back. I bet others will too.
It's like he wants to go back in time, before globalization, when countries were more on their own, focused on themselves. But the world's different now. Climate change, pandemics, economic problems. We have to work together to solve those.
Exactly. And his America First thing might actually hurt those efforts. It's like he's saying the U.S. doesn't want to work with other countries anymore, and that could make the world more divided, less stable.
So he might be getting people excited about America, but he could also be hurting America's reputation in the world and making it harder to, influence things.
And don't forget about the economic side. His protectionist policies, they might actually backfire. Higher prices, job losses, slower growth.
Yeah, it's not as easy as just bringing back factory jobs and boosting the economy. The world's economy is really interconnected.
Right. If he alienates allies and messes up trade, he could actually hurt the economy he's trying to help.
It's a gamble. Could have a big impact on all of us. So as we get into his specific plans, let's keep that bigger picture in mind.
Definitely. We need to connect the dots, see how his policies fit into, the world of geopolitics and economics.
Let's go back to that Q&A with the business leaders.
Yeah.
There were some moments that really showed how he makes decisions and governs.
Remember when Brian Moynihan asked about all the policy changes happening so fast and whether that would hurt economic stability? That was a good question. Got to the heart of what worries people about Trump's, unpredictable way of doing things.
Right. Moynihan was basically saying, how can businesses plan for the future if the rules keep changing? And Trump didn't really answer that.
Nope. He just kept saying that his actions would make the economy grow, pointed to his tax cuts from before as proof. But we know it's more complicated than that.
And that plan to lower the corporate tax rate even more, to 15% for companies making things in the U.S. That makes you wonder about what will happen to government money in the long run and how wealth will be spread around.
Exactly. Businesses will love it now, but later, it could make the gap between the rich and poor even bigger. Man, make it harder for the government to pay for important things.
And then he said banks were discriminating against conservatives without any proof. That's a dangerous thing to say. Makes you think he might interfere with the financial system for political reasons.
Yeah, it shows he'll use his power to punish people who don't agree with him and reward the ones who do. That's not good for democracy. Makes people afraid to speak up.
Anna Boten's question about deregulation was more subtle, but it also showed some problems with his approach. He loves to talk about how he cuts through red tape and gets things done fast. But, like we said, fast doesn't always mean good.
Especially with regulations. If you get rid of them too quickly without thinking it through, you get loopholes, unintended consequences, even disasters.
Right? It's like he just wants to undo everything the last administration did, instead of making smart policies that solve real problems.
And his attacks on the Green New Deal, all those environmental initiatives, shows that he just dismisses anything that doesn't fit his way of thinking.
He doesn't seem to believe in climate change, or that we need renewable energy. He's fine with sacrificing the environment for economic growth.
Which is really short-sighted. We can't just keep using up the planet like it'll last forever. Sooner or later, we'll pay the price.
So Trump's got a lot planned for his second term. He says it'll be a golden age for America. We'll see if he can pull it off.
And even if he does, what'll it cost? His policies will have a big impact here and around the world.
We all need to stay informed, pay attention, hold him accountable.
Absolutely. We got to think critically, question things, demand policies that work for everyone, not just a few.
Well said. So, for everyone listening, what do you think? What's going to happen to America and the world with Trump in charge?
Let us know what you think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.